The heart monitor beeped, steady, mechanical, indifferent. Room 14 of the ICU at St. Mercy General. Hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in a pale, colorless glow. A man sat in the plastic chair beside the bed, unshaven, hollow-eyed, still wearing the same white shirt he had worn 3 days ago. His name was Daniel Harmon. He was 42 years old, and he had not slept, not truly slept, since the night his wife collapsed in their kitchen without warning. Her name was Claire. She was 39, a schoolteacher, a mother, a woman who packed lunch for her daughter every morning with a handwritten note tucked inside. She had been standing at the stove humming something soft, and then nothing. The paramedics had used words like subarachnoid hemorrhage and critical window, and Daniel had stood in the emergency, Bay nodding as though he understood, when in truth the only thing he could hear was the silence, where her humming used to be. 3 days later, the situation had not improved. The doctors arrived each morning, reviewed her chart, spoke in measured tones and left. The nurses adjusted tubes and checked vitals with quiet efficiency. And Daniel sat. He sat and he waited, because there was nothing else a man could do. He was not a wealthy man. He worked in logistics, coordinating freight, schedules for a mid-sized shipping company, decent pay, enough for their mortgage, their daughter Emma's school fees, and the occasional vacation to the coast. But the hospital bills had already begun arriving. Printouts slid under the waiting room door by a billing administrator with apologetic eyes. $47,000 for 3 days in the ICU, the anesthesiologist's fee, the neurology consult, the CT scans, the MRI, numbers that didn't feel real until they were. On the morning of the 4th day, Daniel walked out of the ICU for the first time since Claire had been admitted. Not because he wanted to, but because his legs had simply carried him there, down the long corridor, past the nurses' station, past the children's ward with its cheerful painted animals on the walls, all the way to the small hospital cafeteria at the end of the East Wing. He stood at the counter and stared at the menu board without reading it. "Sir?" The woman behind the counter was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned back neatly and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her name tag said Margaret. "Just tea," Daniel said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. "Just a tea, please." Margaret poured it without a word, a simple paper cup, steam rising gently from the surface. She set it on the counter and looked at him, really looked at him, the way people rarely do in hospitals, where everyone is so careful not to see too much. "ICU?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "How long?" 4 days. She slid the tea across the counter, and then, without a word, she slid a small shortbread biscuit beside it. She didn't charge him. She just looked at him with the kind of eyes that had seen this particular kind of suffering many times before, and said simply, "Sit down for a few minutes. The world won't end while you drink your tea." He almost laughed. He almost cried. He did neither. He just picked up the cup and carried it to the nearest table and sat down. That was when he noticed the man sitting 2 tables away. He was perhaps 70 years old, small-framed, neatly dressed in a grey cardigan despite the warmth of the room. He was looking at a single sheet of paper, a medical report. By the look of it, and his hands were trembling, not from age, from something else entirely. Daniel looked away. He stared at his tea. He thought about Claire. He thought about Emma, who was staying with Daniel's sister and who had asked on the phone last night, in a voice smaller than any 8-year-old's voice should ever be, "Is Mama going to come home, Daddy?" He hadn't answered. He hadn't known how. "They're telling me it's not operable." Daniel looked up. The old man was speaking, not to anyone in particular, it seemed, or perhaps to everyone. His eyes were still on the paper. "Excuse me?" Daniel said. The man looked up then. His eyes were pale blue, watery but steady. "The tumor," he said simply. "They're telling me it's not operable, that there's nothing more to do." He folded the paper carefully, precisely, the way a man folds something he will carry with him for the rest of his life. "I've been sitting here for an hour trying to decide how to tell my daughter." Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his tea, stood, and walked to the old man's table. He sat down across from him. "I'm Daniel," he said. "Walter," the man replied. They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers in a hospital cafeteria, each carrying something too heavy to name. "How old is your daughter?" Daniel asked. 36. "She has 2 boys, my grandsons." Walter's voice softened. "She's going to fall apart. She always falls apart, and then she puts herself back together again. And I have always admired that about her more than I've ever told her." He paused. "I suppose I should tell her that." "While I still can." Daniel wrapped both hands around his paper cup. "My wife is upstairs," he said. "She had a brain bleed 4 days ago. They don't know yet if she'll—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "She's a teacher. She teaches 8-year-olds to read. She has this way of making every child feel like the most important person in the room." He exhaled slowly. "I keep thinking about all the children she hasn't taught yet." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and placed one thin, veined hand on Daniel's forearm. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer a platitude, or a proverb, or the hollow reassurance that everything would be fine. He simply placed his hand there and left it. It was the first human touch Daniel had felt in 4 days that wasn't a doctor checking his pulse, or a nurse guiding him out of the way. It was so simple. It was so enormous. He felt something crack open in his chest, not painfully, like a window being opened in a room that had been sealed too long. They talked for 40 minutes. Walter told him about his late wife, Maria, who had died 8 years ago, and whose absence he still felt every single morning when he reached for the other side of the bed. He told him about his daughter, Sophie, who had her mother's laugh and her grandfather's stubbornness. He told him about the diagnosis, a glioblastoma, grade 4, discovered 3 weeks ago, after a series of headaches that he'd been quietly dismissing for months. Daniel told him about Claire, about the morning she collapsed, about Emma's voice on the phone, about the billing statements, about the fear that had taken up permanent residence somewhere behind his sternum, heavy and cold and immovable, and Walter listened. He listened the way very few people listen, completely, without preparing his next sentence, without checking the clock. He listened as though Daniel's words mattered, as though Daniel mattered. At some point, Margaret from behind the counter appeared with 2 fresh cups of tea, hot, unhurried, unasked for, and set them down on the table, without a word before retreating back to her station. Daniel looked at her. She gave the smallest possible nod and went back to wiping down the counter. That afternoon, something changed. Dr. Anita Sharma, the neurosurgeon overseeing Claire's case, requested a second consultation with Daniel. She had reviewed Claire's most recent MRI scans, alongside a colleague, a specialist she had contacted, specifically because of the complexity of Claire's case. There was, she explained carefully, a new consideration. A minimally invasive endoscopic procedure, still high risk, still uncertain, but a possibility that had not been on the table 72 hours ago. "I want to be clear," Dr. Sharma said, her dark eyes steady and direct. "This is not a guarantee. The risks are significant, but we believe it gives her a real chance." Daniel sat very still. "What do we need to decide?" "I need your consent to proceed. And I need you to understand that even if we do everything right, there are no promises in medicine, only effort. And I promise you, Mr. Harmon, we will give her every effort we have." Daniel signed the consent form. His hand did not shake. That night he returned to the cafeteria. Walter was not there, but Margaret was, closing up for the evening, stacking chairs with the careful, unhurried rhythm of someone who has done the same thing 10,000 times. "The old man in the grey cardigan," Daniel said. "Do you know if he's still here?" Margaret paused. "Mr. Walter? He left about an hour ago. His daughter came." She smiled quietly. He was smiling when they walked out. Really smiling. The kind you don't see much in this building. Daniel nodded slowly. He thought about Walter's hand on his arm, about 40 minutes of being truly heard by a stranger, about the way a single cup of tea, offered without agenda, had opened a door in him that fear had sealed shut. He thought about Emma, about the note he would write her tonight, the first one. he realized he had ever written her. Claire had always been the one who wrote the notes. Maybe it was time he learned. Claire's surgery took 6 hours. Daniel spent those 6 hours in the surgical waiting room on the 3rd floor, a beige, quietly carpeted room with old magazines and a small television mounted in the corner. He did not read the magazines. He did not watch the television. He sat with his hands in his lap, and he thought about everything Walter had said, and everything Walter had not said, and the way that one thin hand on his forearm had reminded him that he was not, in fact, alone in the universe. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Dr. Sharma appeared in the doorway in her scrubs. She was not smiling, but she was not smiling either. She had the careful, composed expression of a physician who has learned to carry news gently. "The procedure went as well as we could have hoped," she said. "She's in recovery. She's stable. The next 48 hours are still critical. I want you to understand that. But she came through the surgery, Mr. Harmon. She came through." Daniel stood. He stood and he put one hand over his mouth and he breathed. "Can I see her?" "Soon. Give us 30 minutes." He nodded. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor toward the cafeteria. It was closed. The lights were off inside. Through the glass he could see the counter where Margaret had stood, the table where Walter had sat, the chair where he himself had collapsed into a stranger's unexpected patience 4 days ago. He stood there for a long moment. Then he pulled a small notepad from his jacket pocket, the same one he used to jot freight schedules, and he wrote 3 words on the top sheet. He folded it and slipped it under the cafeteria door. It read, "Thank you, Margaret." 3 weeks later, Claire Harmon was discharged from St. Mercy General Hospital. She walked out on her own feet slowly, leaning gently on Daniel's arm, squinting into the October sunlight, like someone re-meeting the world for the first time. Emma ran across the parking lot and buried her face in her mother's coat and did not let go for a very long time. The road ahead was long. There would be rehabilitation, follow-up scans, careful months of recovery. The bills were still real. The fear did not vanish. It simply became manageable, something to be carried rather than crushed by. But on the drive home, Emma pressed a folded piece of paper into Claire's hand from the back seat. "I made you something," Emma said. "Every day you were gone, I made you one thing. This is day 22. Claire unfolded it. It was a drawing in crayon, a woman at a stove, humming, surrounded by small yellow stars. Claire looked at Daniel. He was watching the road, but he was smiling. She reached over and placed her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own. As for Walter, Daniel found out, weeks later through a mutual contact at the hospital, that he had enrolled in a palliative care program and was spending his remaining time at home, surrounded by Sophie and his 2 grandsons. A neighbor had mentioned that he had taken to writing letters, long, careful letters, to the people who had mattered to him most, people he had never quite gotten around to telling. No one knows how much time Walter has. No one ever knows. But the people who loved him knew, finally, clearly, without any doubt, that they were loved in return. Sometimes that is the most important surgery of all. There is a kind of kindness that costs nothing and changes everything. It does not require wealth or expertise or extraordinary courage. It requires only the willingness to see another human being, really see them, and to stay for a moment instead of walking past. A cup of tea, a hand on an arm, 2 words, sit down. In a hospital where life and death negotiate their terms in quiet rooms, these things are not small. They are, in fact, everything. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when a stranger's kindness carried you through something you could not carry alone, you are watching the right channel. This is Soul of Kindness. Every story here is a reminder that humanity, at its best, shows up in the smallest gestures. If this one stayed with you, please subscribe and join a community of people who still believe in the extraordinary power of ordinary compassion. And before you go, we want to hear from you. Has a stranger ever shown you kindness in a hospital, or during a moment of crisis that you still think about today? Tell us in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. Soul of Kindness, because every act of kindness has a soul.